Poland, 1981. Part 1. Visions in the Night. The cold of the Polish winter seeped through the stone walls of the seminary, casting a chill that seemed to resonate with the growing despair in the country. In 1981, Poland was under a suffocating grip of the communist regime. Faith had become a whispered secret, carried in the hearts of the people, but expressed only in the shadows. For the government, belief in something greater than the state was a threat, and that threat was met with violence, censorship, and fear. Jakub Kowalski knelt on the cold stone floor of the seminary chapel, the worn wooden pews empty around him. The flicker of candlelight played across his youthful face, casting long shadows that danced with the rising smoke of incense. His hands were clasped tightly together, fingers trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of the prayer in his heart. At just 21 years old, Jakub was in his first year of seminary, but his path had been anything but easy. He had grown up in a small rural village, the son of a humble farmer and a devout mother who had taught him to pray before he could even walk. His father, a man hardened by years of labor, had always warned him that faith alone wouldn't fill the stomach, but Jakub had seen something deeper in the church services they attended in secret. He had felt a call, a pull toward something higher, something more meaningful than the oppressive reality surrounding him. Now, in the silence of the chapel, Jakub sought answers. His days were filled with study, learning scripture, theology, and philosophy, but his nights had become something else entirely. It had begun only a few weeks prior, during his evening prayers. What had once been a time of peaceful reflection had become a series of visions. Visions so vivid and powerful that they left Jakub shaken. At first, he had thought them dreams, the product of his imagination or the strain of his studies. But they had grown more frequent, more intense, until he could no longer deny their meaning. On this night, Jakub's mind was heavy with uncertainty. His breath came in slow, deliberate patterns as he tried to focus, but there was a restlessness in the air. His heart pounded with a strange urgency, a sense of something approaching, something he could neither see nor name, but he could feel it like a storm gathering on the horizon. He lowered his head, the words of the psalm he had been reciting slipping from his lips as he closed his eyes. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Then in an instant the world shifted. Jakub was no longer in the chapel. The cold stone beneath him vanished, replaced by the sensation of soft earth. His breath caught in his throat as he found himself standing in an open field under a darkened sky. The air around him was thick with tension, and he could see his own breath hanging in the air, a mist in the eerie, unnatural silence. The field stretched out endlessly before him, barren and desolate. There was no sound, no wind, only the oppressive quiet that made his skin crawl. He knew this was not a dream. There was a clarity to everything he saw, every detail sharp and defined as though he was awake. Jakub took a hesitant step forward, his foot sinking into the damp earth, and that was when he saw them. At first, it was a shadow on the horizon, a barely perceptible movement in the distance. But as Jakub's eyes adjusted, the shapes began to emerge. Dark, twisted figures rose from the mist, their forms shifting and undulating like smoke. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, and though they had no faces, Jakub could feel their eyes on him, cold and malevolent. The air grew heavy with their presence, and fear gripped Jakub's heart with icy fingers. They were coming for him, no, not just him. They were coming for the city, for the people, for the faith. The figures multiplied, their numbers growing until they formed an army, marching silently toward the place Jakub knew in his soul was his home. The weight of their malevolence pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe, as if the very air had turned against him. He wanted to run, to flee from the darkness that encroached on all sides. But his feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen in place by a force greater than fear. And then, as suddenly as the shadows had appeared, a brilliant light erupted across the field. It was blinding at first, a searing white radiance that burned away the darkness. Jacob shielded his eyes with his hands, his heart racing, but as the light softened, he dared to look up. Standing before him was a figure, tall, radiant, and cloaked in shimmering light. It was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen, yet he knew, without a shadow of doubt, what this being was. It was an angel. The figure's presence filled the air with warmth, a stark contrast to the cold terror that had gripped Jacob moments before. Its eyes, though not human, conveyed a sense of deep compassion, but also a stern command. The angel spoke, though not with words that Jacob could hear. Instead, the message seemed to fill his very soul, reverberating through his body with a power that was both overwhelming and comforting. You have been chosen. Chosen. Jacob's heart pounded as the meaning of the words settled over him. He was no soldier, no leader. He was just a young seminarian. But the angel's gaze never wavered. There was no room for doubt in its eyes. The words echoed again, this time with greater urgency. You must protect the faith. The army of shadows continued their march in the distance, their presence a growing threat that seemed impossible to stop. Jacob's chest tightened with the enormity of what he was being asked to do. Protect the faith? How could he, a single man, young and inexperienced, stand against such darkness? His hands trembled as he looked back at the angel, desperate for guidance, for an answer to the question that weighed on his heart. How? He whispered, his voice small and fragile in the face of the divine. The angel did not answer with words. Instead, it reached out, its hand glowing with a soft, ethereal light. As Jacob watched, the light from the angel's hand began to envelop him, filling his entire being with warmth and strength. It was a strength that came not from him, but from something far greater, a power that transcended human understanding. Jacob could feel it now, coursing through his veins like fire, igniting his soul with a fierce determination. The angel's message was clear. The battle Jacob had seen was not of flesh and blood, but of spirit, of faith. And faith, the angel had shown him, was the greatest weapon of all. As the vision faded, Jacob found himself, once more kneeling in the chapel, the warmth of the angel's presence lingering in the air around him. His heart was still racing, but now it beat with purpose. He had been chosen. He had been called to defend the faith, to stand against the darkness that sought to consume his city, his people, his very soul. Jacob rose from the cold stone floor, his legs unsteady, but his resolve firm. He glanced at the candle before him, its flame flickering gently in the quiet chapel. He had a mission now, one far beyond his own understanding. And though fear still lingered at the edges of his mind, Jacob knew he could not turn away from what he had seen. He would answer the call. He would stand against the shadows. And with God's guidance, he would protect the faith. Part 2. The Gathering. The biting chill of a Polish winter gnawed at Jacob's skin as he made his way through the dimly lit streets of Krakow. His breath hung in the air like a ghostly cloud, dissipating into the night as he pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his body. The weight of the vision he had seen in the chapel just days before was heavy on his mind. The angel's words echoed within him. You must protect the faith. It was a calling that Jacob could not ignore, yet he was unsure where to begin. The fear of the communist regime was palpable. Their control over the people was suffocating. Any act of religious defiance was met with swift and brutal consequences. Churches were closely monitored, priests were watched, and any gatherings deemed suspicious were shut down, often with violence. Faith had become a dangerous thing in Poland, whispered only in the darkest corners where the regime's eyes couldn't reach. But Jacob's vision had ignited something in him, a fire, a sense of divine purpose that overshadowed the fear gnawing at his insides. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. The angel had shown him a war, not just of spirits, but of people, of believers who must stand together. Jacob needed allies, people who still clung to their faith despite the risk. That's what had brought him to this abandoned basement on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind crumbling walls and rusted iron gates. The space was cold and damp, with the scent of mildew clinging to the air, but it had one saving grace. It was isolated. No prying eyes from the government's watchful agents would venture here. Jakob had chosen this place carefully, knowing that the gatherings he planned to organize had to remain in the shadows, at least for now. The dim light of a single candle flickered in the center of the room, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. Jakob stood at the entrance, waiting for those he had contacted to arrive. His heart beat with a mixture of hope and dread. Would anyone come? Would they risk their lives for this? The first to arrive was his closest friend from the seminary, Pyotr, a tall, quiet young man who had always been more cautious than Jakob. Pyotr entered the basement with a hesitant glance over his shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. His face, pale and gaunt from the stress of living under constant surveillance, softened when he saw Jakob. "Are you sure about this?" Pyotr asked, his voice a whisper. "If we're caught." Jakob nodded, meeting his friend's gaze with firm resolve. "I know the risk, Pyotr, but I saw something that makes this worth every danger. We can't stay silent. Not anymore." Pyotr studied him for a long moment before nodding, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Then I'm with you, whatever happens." As the minutes passed, more people began to arrive, slipping into the basement in ones and twos, their faces hidden in the shadows. There was Father Victor, an elderly priest who had once served at a prominent church in the city, but had been forced into hiding after preaching against the regime. His hands, weathered with age and years of devotion, were clasped tightly around a rosary as he entered the room, his eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. Jakob had always admired Father Victor. The priest had been a voice of hope in his early years, a beacon of light in a world growing ever darker. Now, seeing him among the small group, Jakob felt a surge of strength. If Father Victor was here, then this was not a foolish endeavor. "Thank you for coming," Jakob said quietly, his voice breaking the silence of the room. "I know the risks we face, but I believe this is something we must do." The small crowd gathered closer, listening intently. Jakob could see the fear in their eyes, the way they glanced nervously toward the entrance as if expecting soldiers to burst in at any moment. Yet beneath that fear was something else, something deeper. Hope, faith. "God has called us to protect what we believe in," Jakob continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We cannot allow the regime to strip us of our faith, to take from us the very thing that sustains us. I had a vision, a calling, and I know we are not alone in this fight. There is a battle happening, a battle between light and darkness, and we have been chosen to stand in the light." There was a murmur among the crowd, a ripple of uncertainty mixed with curiosity. Jakob could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, but he did not falter. He told them of his vision, of the army of shadows and the radiant figure that had appeared before him. He spoke of the angel's message, of the need to protect the faith, to gather in prayer, and to resist the darkness that threatened to consume their city. "Prayer is our weapon," Jakob said, his voice steady. "It is stronger than anything the regime can use against us. We will meet here, in secret, to pray together, to ask for God's protection and guidance. This is not just for us, but for all who live in fear, for those who have lost hope. We must be the light they can turn to." Father Victor stepped forward then, his presence commanding the room despite his frail appearance. His voice, though aged, carried a depth of conviction that silenced any remaining doubts. "Jakob is right," Father Victor said, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Faith is not a crime, though they treat it as such. It is a gift, and we must cherish it, defend it with all that we have. We will pray here, in this hidden place, and though the world outside grows darker, we will hold fast to the light within us." Slowly, one by one, the gathered believers nodded, their resolve hardening. Jakob could see the change in their faces. What had begun as fear was transforming into something far more powerful. Determination. They were tired of hiding, tired of living in constant fear of a regime that sought to strip them of their identity, their hope, their faith. The gathering grew over the next few weeks. Word spread quietly through whispered conversations in the streets and discreet glances exchanged during church services. People from all walks of life came: students, workers, mothers, even a few soldiers who had lost faith in the regime they served. Each night, the basement filled with soft murmurs of prayer, the flickering candlelight casting halos around their bowed heads. Jakob, though young, had become their leader. He led the vigils with a quiet strength that inspired those around him. His words, simple yet powerful, carried the weight of his vision. Each prayer was a shield, a defiant stand against the oppressive darkness that sought to smother them. But with each passing night, Jakob knew that their time was limited. The regime was watching, always watching, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Yet despite the looming threat, Jakob could not stop. The angel had called him to this mission, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The basement, once cold and lifeless, had become a sanctuary. It was no longer just a hidden place. It was a fortress of faith, where hope was rekindled and where the light of belief burned brighter than ever before. Jakob had set something in motion, something bigger than himself. And though the darkness outside the basement walls grew stronger, inside, the light of their faith was becoming a beacon that could not be extinguished. Part 3, Captured. The crack of the iron door slamming shut echoed through the cold, damp cell. Jakob stumbled forward, his knees buckling as the guards roughly shoved him into the small, windowless room. The walls, covered in grime, pressed in on him, and the stench of mold and decay filled his lungs. He collapsed onto the stone floor, the sting of blood and sweat burning his skin. His body ached, bruises forming where fists had landed during the brutal interrogation. But through the physical pain, Jakob's mind remained steady, his heart clinging to the prayers he had whispered during every strike. Hours earlier, they had found him. The authorities had been watching, waiting for their moment to pounce, and tonight, they had moved with precision. A group of armed soldiers had stormed the basement just as Jakob and his followers were finishing their nightly vigil. The small group had been taken by surprise, their hands raised in submission as the soldiers barked orders, rifles aimed at their heads. There had been no escape, no time to flee. Jakob had been the first one dragged from the basement, thrown into a military truck, and driven to a place he had always feared he might end up: the regime's prison. Now, in the darkness of his cell, Jakob lay still, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His head throbbed from the beating, and the coppery taste of blood lingered on his tongue. The guards had not been gentle. They had demanded names. Who else was involved? Who was leading the gatherings? Where were they meeting next? But Jakob had said nothing. His lips had remained sealed, not out of defiance, but out of duty. He could not betray those who had stood beside him, those who had risked their lives for their faith. In the silence that followed the guard's departure, Jakob let out a slow, shaky breath. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. He was alone, isolated, and at the mercy of the regime. Yet, even in the pit of despair, he could feel something stirring within him, a flicker of strength that had not been extinguished by the fists and threats of his captors. The words of the angel, from his vision weeks before, echoed in his mind. You must protect the faith. But how could he protect the faith from here, locked away in this forsaken place? His body was broken, his movements labored, and his mind clouded with fatigue. Jakob's eyes drifted to the narrow slit in the door, the only source of light in the cell. It was faint, barely illuminating the stone walls around him, but it was enough. In that small sliver of light, Jakob found a semblance of hope. He pushed himself up, leaning against the cold wall as his muscles protested. Every movement sent jolts of pain through his body, but Jakob didn't care. He needed to pray. Slowly, he clasped his hands together, his knuckles white from the pressure. His lips moved silently as he began to speak the words that had carried him through every moment of suffering. Our Father, who art in heaven. The familiar prayers soothed the ache in his heart, reminding him that he was not truly alone. Somewhere beyond these prison walls, his friends were still praying, still fighting for their faith. Somewhere in the dark streets of Krakow, the light of belief still flickered, fragile but enduring. Jacob's breath steadied as he continued to pray, his voice barely more than a whisper. As the hours stretched on, the darkness in the cell seemed to deepen, and Jacob's prayers grew more fervent. He prayed for his community, for those who had been arrested alongside him, and for the strength to endure whatever came next. He prayed for his family, his mother and father, who had always told him that faith was a shield, and he prayed for the future of his country, for freedom from the suffocating grip of the regime. But no matter how much Jacob prayed, the cell remained cold, the silence oppressive. Time felt distorted. He had no sense of whether it had been hours or days since he had been thrown into this pit. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and exhaustion tugged at his mind, pulling him towards sleep. But Jacob refused to give in. He could not afford to be weak. Not now, not when so much was at stake. Then, in the middle of the night, as Jacob sat in silence, something happened. The air in the cell changed. It was subtle at first, a shift that he could barely detect, but soon it became unmistakable. The damp, stagnant air seemed to stir, and a soft glow began to form in the corner of the room. Jacob's heart quickened as he turned toward the source of the light. It was the angel. The same radiant figure that had appeared in his vision stood before him now, its light filling the small cell with warmth and peace. The angel's presence was overwhelming, yet comforting, like the embrace of a long-lost friend. Jacob's breath caught in his throat, his body trembling as the angel's gaze settled on him. "You are not alone," the angel said, its voice soft but powerful, echoing within Jacob's soul. "Your prayers have been heard." Jacob's eyes filled with tears. He had never felt such a profound sense of peace, even in the darkest moments of his captivity. The angel's words washed over him, soothing the pain in his heart and body. He felt lighter, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders, if only for a moment. "Do not fear, Jacob," the angel continued, its voice like a gentle breeze. "You have been chosen to endure this trial, but it will not be in vain. Your faith is a weapon that cannot be broken, not by bars, not by chains, not by any force on this earth. Hold fast to your belief, and you will see the light of freedom again." Jacob nodded, unable to speak as the tears flowed down his face. He felt the truth of the angel's words in his very bones. The fear that had gripped him in the dark corners of his mind began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He knew now that his imprisonment was not the end. It was a part of the battle, a test of his resolve. And Jacob would not fail. The angel reached out, its hand glowing with ethereal light, and placed it on Jacob's shoulder. Instantly, warmth spread through him, erasing the pain and exhaustion that had plagued him since the guards had dragged him into the cell. It was as though the very touch of the divine had healed him, not just physically, but spiritually. Jacob closed his eyes, allowing himself to bask in the angel's presence, feeling more alive than he had in days. "Remember this," the angel said, its voice growing softer as the light began to fade. "Your faith will carry you through. You are never alone." And just like that, the angel was gone. The cell was once again dark and cold, but Jacob's heart was filled with light. He sat for a long time, replaying the angel's words in his mind, clinging to the message of hope that had been given to him. Jacob knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The regime would not give up its hold on him without a fight, and there would be more trials to face. But now, with the knowledge that he was not alone, Jacob felt stronger than ever. His faith had been tested, but it had not been broken, and as long as he held on to that faith, he knew he would find a way through the darkness. With renewed determination, Jacob rose to his feet. He paced the small confines of his cell, his mind racing with plans and prayers. He didn't know how or when, but he knew that he would be free. The angel had told him so, and Jacob believed. Part 4. Freedom's Dawn. The cold, gray light of early morning bathed the streets of Krakow as Jacob stood outside the prison gates, his mind struggling to process the events that had just unfolded. He had been released, without warning, without explanation, without even the presence of guards. One moment, he had been lying on the cold floor of his cell, praying for deliverance. The next, the door had swung open, and a guard had ordered him to leave. No interrogation, no threats, no further demands, just freedom. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped through the iron gates, as if they might give way beneath him at any moment. The cold air stung his face, a sharp contrast to the stale, oppressive atmosphere inside the prison walls. For a moment, Jakob hesitated, unsure of where to go, unsure of whether this was real or some cruel trick designed to break him further. But as he took a deep breath and looked around, the familiar streets of Krakow came into focus, and he knew that this was no illusion. He was free. But why? How? These questions spun in his mind, colliding with the surge of emotions that coursed through him. Fear, disbelief, relief, gratitude, they all mixed together in a dizzying whirlwind. Jakob had expected his imprisonment to last weeks, months, maybe even years. He had prepared himself for the long fight, for the grueling tests of endurance and faith that awaited him behind those iron bars. And now, here he was, standing on the outside, his body bruised but his spirit unbroken. Jakob's hand unconsciously rose to his chest, where the faint warmth of the angel's touch still lingered. The words spoken in the cell echoed in his mind. Your faith will carry you through. You are never alone. Had his release been the result of divine intervention? He couldn't shake the feeling that something far greater than human power had been at work. The regime, so ruthless and unforgiving, would not have released him without cause, unless that cause was beyond their control. Still, uncertainty gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. There were no answers yet, only questions. He needed to return to the community, to find the others who had been arrested with him, to understand what had happened during his absence. Were they safe? Had they been released as well? Or were they still suffering under the regime's cruel hand? The streets were unusually quiet for this hour, the early morning stillness broken only by the distant clatter of carts and the occasional murmur of voices. Jakob kept his head down, his heart pounding with each step. He moved through the narrow alleys, his body tense with the memory of his arrest. At any moment, he half expected to hear the sound of boots behind him, to feel the rough grip of a soldier's hand on his shoulder. But as he continued his journey through the city, it became clear that no one was following him. As he reached the familiar district where the secret gatherings had been held, Jakob's chest tightened with emotion. The sight of the old, crumbling buildings, their windows covered with grime and their doors worn from years of neglect, filled him with both sorrow and hope. This was where it had all begun. The basement where the prayers had first been whispered, where faith had been reignited in the hearts of the oppressed. Jakob approached the hidden entrance to the basement, his steps faltering as a flood of memories washed over him. He had led those vigils, guided by a conviction so strong that even the threat of imprisonment couldn't extinguish it. And now, standing here again, he wondered if that conviction had been enough. Had his imprisonment weakened the resolve of the others? Or had it strengthened them, as he had always prayed it would? Pushing open the rusted door, Jakob descended into the basement. The familiar scent of damp earth and old stone greeted him, and the faint light of candles flickered in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. They were still here. The community had not scattered in fear. They had continued. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Jakob's eyes widened. The basement was packed with people, far more than there had been before. Mothers, fathers, children, students, workers, priests. They all sat or knelt in prayer, their voices low, but united in a powerful murmur that filled the space with a sense of strength and unity. The light of the candles bathed their faces in a soft glow, casting an almost ethereal warmth over the room. Jakob stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight. This was more than he had ever imagined. The community had grown in his absence, flourishing despite the danger. His imprisonment had not broken them. It had galvanized them. The message he had planted had taken root and blossomed into something far greater than himself. And now, standing before them, Jakob realized the full extent of what faith could accomplish. Jakob, a familiar voice broke through the low hum of prayer. Pyotr, his closest friend from the seminary, rushed toward him, his face alight with a mixture of relief and joy. He grabbed Jacob's shoulders, his eyes scanning his friend's bruised and battered appearance. "They released you," Pyotr said, his voice trembling with disbelief. We thought they would never let you go." Jakob nodded, still trying to find the words to explain what had happened. "I don't know why or how," he said quietly. "But I'm here." Pyotr smiled, his grip on Jakob's shoulders tightening. "It's a miracle," he whispered. "We prayed for you every night. We never stopped." Jakob felt a lump form in his throat as he glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the men and women who had risked everything to keep the faith alive. He could see the hope in their faces, the belief that their prayers had been answered, that his release was a sign from God. And in that moment, Jakob knew that they were right. Father Victor stepped forward from the group, his old eyes gleaming with pride and gratitude. He placed a hand on Jakob's arm, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "Your faith has inspired many, Jakob," he said. "More than you know." Jakob shook his head humbly. "It wasn't me. It was all of us. It was our faith together that brought us through this." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Jakob's words settling over the group. Then, one by one, they began to rise, gathering around him in a circle. The candles flickered as the warmth of their presence filled the space, a quiet but powerful energy radiating from their collective belief. "We cannot stop now," Jakob said, his voice steady. "This is only the beginning. We've seen what faith can do. We've seen its power. But the regime is still strong, and there are many who still live in fear. We have to continue. We have to be the light for those who have none." Heads nodded in agreement, the determination in the room growing with each passing moment. Jakob felt the strength of their conviction like a physical force, a tide of hope that could not be stopped. And he knew that they were ready to continue the fight, not with weapons or violence, but with prayer, with unity, and with an unshakable faith in the power of the divine. As the first rays of morning light crept through the cracks in the basement walls, Jakob stood among his people, his heart filled with gratitude and purpose. He had been freed, not just from the chains of the regime, but from the doubt that had once plagued him. He knew now, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that faith could conquer even the darkest of evils. And with this knowledge, he was ready to lead his people into a new dawn. Part 5. A light rekindled. The heavy wooden doors of the old church creaked open, and a soft murmur of voices echoed through the high stone walls as people filtered in, filling the pews row by row. Light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting vibrant hues of red, blue, and gold onto the worn floorboards. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was also a sense of peace that permeated the room, a stark contrast to the fear that had once gripped this community. Jakob stood at the front of the church, his hands resting on the back of the pulpit, his gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. The faces before him were familiar, yet they carried a new energy, a sense of renewal and hope that had not been present in those dark days of repression. Many of the people who had once knelt in the cold, damp basement, whispering prayers in the shadows, were now here, openly practicing their faith without fear. It had been months since Jakob's release from prison, months of slow but undeniable change. The regime's hold on Poland had weakened, cracks beginning to form in the once impenetrable wall of oppression. Rumors of political shifts and movements for freedom had spread through the city, whispers of change that had grown louder with each passing week. And now, for the first time in years, the people of Krakow were beginning to see the light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. Jakob's heart swelled with emotion as he took in the sight before him. This gathering was more than just a service. It was a testament to the power of faith, to the strength of a community that had refused to give up, even when the world seemed determined to crush them. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for, everything they had prayed for. And Jakob knew, as he stood there, that this was only the beginning of something far greater. Father Victor, standing beside him, placed a gentle hand on Jakob's shoulder. The old priest's eyes, filled with pride and gratitude, met Jakob's, and for a moment, the two shared a silent understanding. Father Victor had been Jacob's guide through the darkest times, his wisdom and quiet strength a constant source of support. Now, seeing the community they had nurtured stand united in faith, Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, not for himself, but for the people who had found their way through the storm. "It's a beautiful sight," Father Victor said softly, his voice full of warmth. Jacob nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It is," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "More than I ever imagined." As the congregation settled, the soft hum of conversation faded into a reverent silence. Jacob stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest as he prepared to speak. It was not nervousness that caused his heart to race. It was the weight of the moment, the understanding that this was a turning point not just for him, but for the entire community. "My brothers and sisters," Jacob began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "we have been through trials that none of us could have imagined. We have faced fear, repression, and suffering. Many of us have lost loved ones, endured imprisonment, and seen the darkest sides of humanity. But through it all, we never lost our faith. We never lost our belief in something greater than ourselves." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had stood by him, who had risked their lives for the same cause. "It was our faith that carried us through," Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger. "It was our unity, our determination to hold on to what we believe in, that brought us to this day. And now, as we stand on the threshold of a new era, I ask you to remember that this is only the beginning." The congregation remained silent, their attention fully on Jacob as he spoke, their eyes filled with hope. Jacob could feel the energy in the room, the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, that this moment was part of a much larger story. "We have fought for our right to believe, to pray, to live our lives according to our faith," Jacob said, his voice echoing through the stone walls of the church. "But the fight is not over. The world outside these walls is still full of challenges. There are still those who would try to silence us, who fear the power of faith because they do not understand it. But we must not be afraid. We must continue to stand together, to be the light in the darkness, to show the world that faith is not something that can be crushed." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation, and Jacob's heart swelled with pride. He could see the strength in their faces, the unwavering belief that had brought them through the darkest times. These were the people who had prayed with him in secret, who had risked everything to keep their faith alive. And now, they were free to stand in the light, unafraid. Father Victor stepped forward then, his presence commanding the attention of the room. Though his body was frail, his spirit was strong, and his voice carried with it the weight of years of wisdom and faith. "Jacob speaks the truth," Father Victor said, his voice steady. "Faith is our greatest weapon, and it is one that can never be taken from us. We have seen what it can do, how it can move mountains and break chains. We must hold on to that truth, no matter what the future holds." The old priest's words settled over the congregation like a blessing, and for a moment there was a stillness in the room, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had all been on. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to rise from their seats, their faces shining with tears and smiles. They gathered around Jacob and Father Victor, offering words of gratitude, of encouragement, of hope. Jacob stood in the midst of them, his heart full to bursting. He had never imagined that his life would lead him here, to this moment of profound connection and purpose. He had been just a young seminarian, unsure of his place in the world, unsure of how to answer the call he had been given. But now, standing among his people, Jacob understood that this was where he was meant to be. This was the fulfillment of the vision he had been shown so many months ago. As the sun began to set outside the church, casting long shadows across the floor, Jacob knew that the Real work was only just beginning. There would be new challenges ahead, new battles to fight, but he was no longer afraid. His faith, and the faith of the people who stood with him, was unshakable. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that they were not alone. The church bells rang out across the city, their clear, resonant tones filling the air with a sense of peace and hope. And as Jakob looked out over the city of Krakow, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, he smiled. The dawn of a new beginning had arrived. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.